can discuss where my research is going. But I'm looking specifically at the use of mourning, and by two groups in particular, Quiz Bashback and the Animal Liberation in Victoria, where I live. And I want to show how activists use, or I want to show how the human is constructed against queers and animals, and queers and non-human animals become their abject, and then mourning is used by these activists to kind of make the human, to bring about that abjection and to change that. Hang on, just let me get some water. Lucky it's early enough that my puppy's still asleep, so she won't be barking the whole way through. So I'm going to start off by talking about the book American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. I don't know if people have read the book, it's really, really scary, but there's a lot of critique, cultural critique that happens in the book. And the main character, his name is Bateman, is a Wall Street banker and is also a psychopath who goes from talking about what clothes he's wearing to eating dead animals to killing other humans. And it's a comment about capitalism in modern society. And at one point he comes across a pride parade as he's walking to work, and he's so disgusted, he says, "I watched with a certain traumatized fascination, my mind reeling with the concept that a human being, a man, could feel pride over sodomizing another man." He's so disgusted he goes home and tortures to death a small dog. So I think this brings up three really important issues. Firstly, the concept of a woman is less than a man, evidence in the fact that he says, "I feel disgusted that a human being, a man, could feel pride over sodomizing another man," because women are to be penetrated as they're not human. Secondly, murder is less deplorable than sodomy. And lastly, the use of an animal in order to regain power, as envisioned in heteronormative masculinity. So my focus is on the final point, but the other ones are all obviously very important. So Bateman's manhood, his masculinity, is apparently challenged by the pride parade, and he can only regain this by torturing an animal. And throughout the book he reacts by killing people, potentially in his imagination, when he's challenged, disgusted or aroused, yet torturing a dog is what regains his manhood. And the first time that we actually get a murder described to us in details is when he kills a homeless African-American man and calls him racist and homophobic slurs, and then he has a dog next to him and he then maims the dog. But I think that throughout the book Ellis is obviously using animals as a metaphor for the way that he sees animals to be, the way that Bateman sees animals is less worthy than humans. But obviously I'm in a crowd where I don't need to kind of debunk that we don't think such things as thoughts. So I think that we can kind of turn this around and see that in fact that Bateman's actually replacing the animal with the queer, and that he sees them as equally unworthy of life, and this kind of creates an objection, what Julia Kristeva calls an objection. And she says there looms within objection one of those violent dark revolts of being. And she discusses this in the powers of horror, and she says the abject is from the body. The urge is to repeal the abject from the body, to make it outside of the self, so it becomes other. She's awake. We'll get to meet her, hopefully. She says the abject has only one quality of the object, that of being opposed to I. In explaining this, Judith Butler says there appears as an expulsion of alien elements, but the alien is effectively established through this expulsion. So the body tries to seal itself from this abjection, but it cannot by its very nature exist without that which it defines itself against. So within the binary system of masculine and feminine, the queer is an objection because the queer is outside of this discourse, as the only acceptable male body is within the hegemonic. Sorry, it's 7 in the morning. Have to bear with my mouth not working. So the male body is within hegemonic masculinity as the penetrator, and the woman is the one to be penetrated. So Bateman recreates the homosexual as the woman, and this allows him to reassert himself as the hegemonic penetrator who is human. But actually, in this act of ridding himself of the abject, he draws back the boundaries of himself, and inevitably those boundaries cannot exist without that which they object. And here the heteronormative construct, as envisioned in Bateman, is consequently penetrated by the homosexual. So he turns to killing a dog. So in Bateman trying to expel the queer from the self by killing a puppy, he creates himself the construct as actually of himself always being linked to those objections. Interestingly, at a later point in the book, one of his male friends tries to seduce him when he's about to murder the man, and he can't actually go ahead with killing this other queer male. So it's interesting because it shows that he uses non-human animals in his construct of the queer as unworthy of life. So obviously this is a fictional book, but I think that because it's such a comment on society, we can use it in a larger societal view, and to show that how the boundaries of the self are drawn against the alive animal or queer, because they force us to look at these constructed boundaries. But I want to kind of challenge Chris David, who says that the greatest objection is the dead body. She says the corpse, the most sickening of wastes, is a border that is encroached upon everything. The corpse, seen without God and outside of science, is the utmost of objection. But I think that, in fact, it's the alive animal or queer that's the abject, that the desired is the dead animal, as in meat, and the dead queer is the erased non-heterosexual. So the abject is killed through the abattoir or gay bashing in order to remove it from the boundaries of the self. Ironically, as Diana Schwadewell points out, the huge machine that is factory farming, whilst bringing about death, must also bring about life. We cannot have the non-abject unless we first have the abject alive animal. And Diana Fuss similarly points out that the undead queer person, the person who keeps coming back even when everything's against them, is necessary in order to create positive heterosexual identity. So the place of the non-heterosexual can only comprehend the outside, the not me, through a negative image of that which is not the self. So this life is why Bateman cannot stand the Pride Parade. And it makes me wonder what he would think of the animal liberation float that's in the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras every year. So if the queer and the non-human are the abject, how does mourning become a tool for making them penetrate the sphere of the non-abject, the worthy? So that's obviously like a lot of theory kind of gone over really quickly. So I just thought I'd quickly talk about gay liberation in Australia, because it's got a similar trajectory to America, but I guess some people there might not know the history so much. So when Australia was invaded by Britain, the first law that was ever created was that the sentence of hanging, the first white Australian law, I mean, that was the sentence of hanging would await anyone found guilty of murder or sodomy. So the last state in Australia to decriminalise homosexuality was Tasmania in 1994. And currently in Queensland, another state in Australia, the age of consent for anal sex is 18 years of age, while the consent for all other sexual behaviour is 16. The Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras happens every year, and it started in 1979 to commemorate the Stonewall riots in America. And that was it was a protest, and it did end up in a large riot, and about 53 people were arrested and were faced some serious police brutality. And now many years later, we have the police and the military that march in the parade. And then a couple of years ago, in 2011, the animal liberation float wasn't allowed to march in the parade because they were said to be not queer enough, which is highly ironic because you have large corporations like ICAS who actually pay people to act gay in their floats. So this is the kind of similar trajectory to America, where and lots of places throughout the world, with this neoliberalisation of the queer movement, queer rights or what have you. And so this last year, I don't know if it came into your media, we had a filmed case of police brutality, which there's been many incidences of police brutality at the Mardi Gras, but this one just happened to be caught on camera, as a young boy being beaten up by the police. And from this, there was a community forum held by the Mardi Gras Committee, in which they stated people attending the forum will be able to offer ideas about how policing practices can be enhanced to the benefit of both Sydney Mardi Gras patrons and police. So this ended up in a call for enhanced policing rather than removing police from the parade. and the Assistant Police Commissioner stated that he does not believe the incident will permanently damage relationships with the community. And he also went on to say that the police officer filmed hitting the young man is from the western suburbs of Sydney, where policing is a different kettle of fish. The western suburbs of Sydney, so Mardi Gras takes place in the inner city, and the western suburbs is about an hour or so out of the main part of Sydney, and the media is depicted as having lots of gang wars and drug crimes, etc. And it's an area that's known to be have a lot of people that are not Anglo, particularly people from Arab descent. So he actually reduces this case of institutional state violence to a single officer, and then uses that to racially vilify people who live in the area, and then to show that if the people of colour didn't exist in that area, there wouldn't be any homophobic police violence. So he takes the emphasis off the homophobia and makes it about badly behaved people in the western suburbs, and lets good gays and lesbians from the inner city suburbs know that if they are white and hold respectable jobs, they won't actually be targeted by the police. So this is a kind of a case of what Jasmine Puar called pinkwashing, and it's kind of very similar to what happens in America as well. So it's a very brief history of the Mardi Gras and what's kind of happening with gay liberation in Australia. And in my research, I'm interested in looking at what's seen as the more extremes to that kind of more mainstream narrative in such groups as Queer Splash Back or the Animal Liberation Front. I guess lots of people there probably know more about Queer Splash Back or might have been part of it. It was a militant group in America. And there was some cases of it actually happening in Australia. It's really hard to document. And they did a lot of communiques and actions and had a really militant ethic. But I think some of their most interesting actions were ones where they did actually use mourning as a tool. And one example of this was a solidarity march with What Queer, which was a funeral procession to what they called places of locations of state violence. And it was to mourn, they said it was to mourn Oscar Grant, to mourn 800 dead in Gaza, to mourn teenagers who are coerced into joining the military, and so on. So this was a public funeral, what they called collective grief. And it was about, it brought the abject queer and trans body along with other oppressed minorities to the forefront of people's minds. And another case that I'm looking at is an action that happened here in Victoria by Animal Liberation, which I wish I could show you the images, with 200 of us stood in Federation Square, which is a big public area, holding a dead animal each. And we just stood there for about 45 minutes, and it was a really horrible but really confronting action. And there was a large plaque at the front for a memorial stone for all the dead animals. So this brings the kind of mourning, the use of mourning back to animal liberation action. And I guess I've been reading a little bit of Judith Butler and kind of thinking about how her work fits into this, because she talks about who is considered as worthy of grief. So if the queer is framed, or the animal, non-human animal is framed as the abject, the unworthy of life, I want to think about how bringing mourning and grief to those lives makes them breathable and therefore worthy of life, in Butler's words. But I guess it's quite fraught to use Butler because she states, perhaps then it should come as no surprise that I propose to start and to end with the question of who of the human, as if there was any other way for us to start or end. She doesn't even consider the non-human animal. And I guess her sphere of knowledge falls really ignorant of non-humans, and I guess the earth as a whole, because there is situations in which we do and can mourn for the earth, for the loss of forests, or etc. But that's outside my research. And she goes on to state who counts as human, whose lives count as lives, and finally, what makes for a breathable life. How am I doing for time? I think I still have a few minutes. So she completely disregards any chance of discussing the grievability of non-humans by premising her what makes for a grievable life with the question of the human. And great. I think I've got a bit less than that. Sorry, I lost my spot. piece. So she completely disregards any chance of discussing the grievability of non-humans by premising her what makes for a grievable life with the question of the human. She refuses to allow the possibility of looking outside her anthropomorphism. I'm not going to get that out this time in the morning. This refusal, interestingly, almost begs for a reading of the abject. Butler's refusal to see humans as animals creates the non-human animal as the abject, not me. And as we saw with Christopher, this not me, this outside of me, in fact creates the self. Therefore, Butler is inadvertently pinning the non-human as a part of the self, and this self, this animal self, then constitutes the question of grievability. Is the abject, the not me, grievable? Perhaps this is not Butler's original question, but it makes for a pretty interesting discussion. So if Butler refuses to see the non-human as grievable, and therefore creates the non-human as abject, she only solidifies the non-human as actually in need of grieving. Just as humans remain unnamed in wars and famines, so do billions of non-human animals in factory farms, laboratories and sporting events. The non-life of the non-human in fact serves to therefore create the human both literally and philosophically. By the former, I allude to our interactions with animals that fuel our society, such as the clothes that people wear and who they eat and the cosmetics they consume. Our society is obviously founded on the abuse of non-human animals. But to the latter, I refer to the creation of the human by the abject, not me, of the animal. Butler tries to show that mourning is a political act, that this continuation of public mourning, as seen by groups such as Queers Bashback and Animal Liberation Victoria, is trying to claim a life is worthy through the loss of that life. And Butler shows that unworthy lives are those that were never deemed livable. Though through public mourning those lives become grievable and therefore lives that were in fact lived. Their position as abject is in fact creating the boundaries of the self. And their position as abject creates the boundaries of the self and brings those to life. So I guess I'm interested in drawing out this use of mourning to bring forth the objection, and I think it opens up some pretty interesting questions, such as where are the boundaries of the self and how does mourning challenge this? Can we be unaffected by mourning? And if the not me becomes a part of the self, what do we next draw our boundaries against? Or can we in fact be boundaryless? Thank you.
Okay. Sarah, you're next.
Okay. He's Gretchen if you're still there, and koala.
I'm just going to tell her, hang on, questions.
My dissertation is a creative and critical hybrid, and the creative portion is a poetry manuscript called Queer Fish. I'm writing about queer...
Would you mind wearing a microphone?
Oh, sure. Let's see, is this it?
No, there is one that...
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So this poetic statement is, I'm writing it in conjunction with a poetry manuscript called Queer Fish, and I'm attending to issues of representation, animal communication, and the intersections of queer theory with posthumanism and critical animal studies. In this essay, I take my cue from Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, whose thesis is there are important senses in which queer can signify only when attached to the first person. All it takes to make the description queer a true one is the impulsion to use it in the first person. I have an incurable attachment to lost things. Words, for example. The word I've been thinking about lately is in the process of being lost to history. Although obscure, the word suggests a philosophy, a feeling connected to the animal. The word I happened upon is mansuetude, which is etymologically related to hands and handling. The prefix man, the root of words like manual, manage, and manufacture, relates to hands, to being handy. The suffix "tude," according to the OED, conveys the idea of custom. The term roughly translates as a state of becoming accustomed to the hands and subsequently becoming milder in the process. So think, for example, of the feral cat grazing near a back door. Then think of that door opening to reveal a glass of water, a dish of food. Then a few days later, a soft voice and an extended hand. And by small but measurable degrees, the human comes to mind the animal, and a mutual regard develops between the two. The OED defines mansuetude as a Middle English term meaning mildness, gentleness, and tameness, yet in our contemporary lexicon, there's no exact equivalent for the word. The words that come closest, taming, domesticating, breaking in, and training, all suggest dimensions of power and control, the idea of forcing an animal to human submission. My interest in mansuetude is that it inflects reciprocity rather than domination, and has been applied both to the human and animal. It refers to a process of mutual subjectivation, pointing back to a history when the human hand was not associated with breaking the other, but rather with the potential for positive, reciprocal interaction. And this is a kind of conditional form of feeling, not attributive or possessive, but rather a relational term connected to self-affection through handling of the other. By this definition, touch is sensitive, imminent, powerful, and transformative. I want to suggest that living with animals is in many ways a project of the imagination, and of making language suppler, more physicalized, and more in touch with its origins. To confound our humanness, to find dormant within ourselves our own animality, which surfaces in dream work and poetry, and in our most naked desire, we recover the materials needed for our own survival. For every discovery that makes us less human, we are also becoming queerer, more at home with our own otherness. Animating this essay is the question, what is the poetics of the animal? Is it a play of surfaces, sounds, moments of contact? Is it of the unconscious, the marshy realm of dream work? And must it be mediated by allegory, symbol, and metaphor, or might there be a non-figural or animistic mode of approaching animal thought? Inevitably, it is physical, gestural of the body. The texture, for example, of my cat's damp fur in my hands, her reflection in a minnow pool, her trills in the early dawn, these encounters and gestures I reformulate into meaning. I draw upon them to imagine my cat's world, even while interior meaning is opaque, and the work that I do is suppositional. And ineluctably, like the play of light upon the clean surfaces of a prism, my cat, looking back at me, refracts a litany of selves. My being, my world, my culture, my sex, my race, my radical otherness. Like Jacques Derrida, I am both a cultural animal and a radical foreigner in my own body. I feel that familiar careening sensation of being held at the threshold of language as I try to describe myself through her eyes and her through my eyes. When language has failed me or I have failed it, I am neither master nor prisoner to it, and yet the vocabulary of futility creeps in, and the syntax of subjecthood and objecthood become confused, slippery. I am drawn to an animal language. In Western traditions, animals have been identified as lesser because of their absent linguistic capacity. If humans assert their subjectivity through speech, it has been argued that animals lack the capacity to perform their subjectivity through language. This failure to speak has been traditionally read as an ontological failure, which is used to reinterpret describe the border between the animal and the human. Martin Heidegger, for example, denies language to animals, writing, quote, "Where there is no language, as in the being of stone, plant, and animal, there is also no openness of what is." However, in animistic cultures, animals, stones, and plants are endowed with their own language and are even regarded as intelligible. Denied subjectivity in the Western world, however, the animal was cast adrift from a community premised on human fraternity. The same can be said of those relegated to the fringes of society. The criminal, the homosexual, or racial other also exist within a zone of dehumanization. Legitimating state racism and homophobia, biopolitics rests on a model of sovereign power that founds itself on its capacity to mark off this othered space. How might we then conceive of a non-sovereign power that emerges in the conjunction between the human and the animal and that grounds itself in language? For Jacques Derrida, the trace of the animal, of the radical other, exists within the very structure of speech. And yet it would seem that being without speech, animals enter an aporia in which they are both of and beyond human language. Thinking through of the trace of iterability of difference, without which language would not exist, Derrida argues that these concepts or possibilities are themselves not only human, thereby carving open a space in which both animal and human being are mutually bound to the constitution of the other and to language itself. And if we can think beyond human speech, we may find that while animal language may seem to be limited semantically or representationally, it is in fact inherently powerful for the reason that it is not a codified system and therefore cannot be passively exchanged. Instead, it is gestural, based on an organic principle connected to attention. Animal signaling, for example, is occasioned when there is mutual attention between the signaler and the recipient of the signal. Both have a significant stake in observing one another when their own survival may depend on it. Based on the consciousness, such communication is immediate, variable, and corporeal. According to the evolutionary biologist Amat Zahivi, animal signaling is also costly. Extrapolating from Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, Zahivi sought to explain what Darwin could not: the waste or excess that an individual incurs in displaying its sexual fitness for potential suitors. While for Darwin, natural selection is premised on the species' elimination of unfavorable traits over time as a mechanism for survival, Zahivi developed the concept of the honest signal and the handicap principle to explain the phenomenon whereby individuals possess characteristics or behave in such a way as to communicate honestly, even at the cost of making themselves vulnerable to attack. He calls this the honest signal. According to Zahivi, these handicaps are signals to other individuals. Extrapolating from sexual selection, he applied his theory of signaling to all realms in which individuals communicate. As he reminds us, where human language often fails its expressive function, the nonverbal vocalized language of animals is generally able to convey intensity and degree of feeling relatively accurately. So think of a baby bird crying for its mother to return to the nest. That signal, the baby's cry, in its repetitive cast, conveys the intensity of its need for contact, operating as a gauge of quality. With this persistent cry, the infant bird risks the detection of a predator, and yet because its cry is risky, the mother knows that it is an honest signal and that its infant needs her attention. This form of signaling involves the testing of bonds. It is a kind of communication authenticated by the cost that the individual incurs in exposing its need. In my own case, I have often felt a frustration with the capacity of symbolic language to express gradations of difference, to convey degree and quality of feeling. There's always a social dilemma inherent in the structure of language and, by extrapolation, the text, that of trying to capture in words one's affective experience to the other. And this dilemma I associate with both wounding and desire, or the wound that lies at the heart of language. This wound is in many ways a human burden. What one wants is the accuracy of the honest signal. And this desire for effective accuracy and reciprocity, I believe, is what bridges the connection between the animal and poetic thought. It is that lonely, fertile zone between desire and honesty, as I have defined it here, that is the terrain of the poet. And in that space, we create metaphor and innovate new forms to temporarily stabilize the chaos of feeling. I asked what poetry might learn from a modality of language that in its economy of sacrifice is authenticated by the other. In conceptualizing my impulsion towards a queer posthumanist lyric poetry, I must also address my own very human identities and consider the ways they bring into relief the limits of language. The moment that I name each social group to which I belong, I confront both the constraints of prose and the prosiness of my own life. For example, while I can say that I am white and a black ally, a feminist, and a lesbian, these categories risk inflecting a particular typology or a form of binarized thinking in which my identity is conceptualized in opposition to masculinity and heterosexuality. Of course, sex, gender, and sexual orientation are not so neat and binary. Conceptually, it is useful to recognize that my identities are socioculturally rooted and contingent upon a system that is gendered, classed, and racialized, yet they are also limited. The moment that I name them, I exclude all the other subject positions I inhabit, transverse, evolve through, trouble, depend on, and imagine for myself. Often my identities escape by their own complexity any label or categorical determination. By a queer logic, how I relate to the non-human world and to other racial, class, gendered, and sexual experiences are as related to my own being as those identities that I claim for myself. Queerness, which I also claim for myself, offers tension against the principles of identity, which can impose strictures not only on sexuality, but also humanness itself. When struggling through the impingements of my own human identities, I have turned to animals and poetry for answers about myself. These have been important queering resources throughout my life insofar as they complicate my own subjectivity. It seems significant now that as a child, before I could call myself a lesbian, I intuited myself as queer, that is, unable to master or integrate into my being the identities that the world assigned to me. Lyric poetry, which inflects the realm of metaphor and the imagination, makes room for a plurality of selves and the chaos of feeling. Like queer theory, it enables me to think through the complexities of being in a way that an identity-based language does not. It accommodates what does not lay down to prose. It roots paradox and antithesis. However, in times of crisis, it seems that we as poets are especially pressured to defend the relevance of our craft. Of course, the question of relevance is an anxious one that permeates the whole of humanities today. The questions handed to the poet often relate to potential, as in what is the power of poetry in a time of emergency? What is the role of poetry in English times? And given recent developments in our ecosystem and our political life, how can poetry act in a fragile world? Lyric time moves at a different clock pace than the temporal exigencies of ecological and political crisis. How and when can it intervene? What are needed are new metaphors, as well as more refined conceptualizations of the structure of metaphor that prepare us for practical action. I'm interested in the power of metaphors that emerge from the combination of imaginative projection and empirical observation of organic lives different than our own. How we relate to those lives and how we imagine their worlds and their sensoriums can provide practical knowledge about ourselves, others, and the world that we share. Metaphor is more than ornament and figurative representation. It is vital and deeply connected to our own cognitive processes. We make meaning through metaphor and through neural tricks that confound the boundaries between the literal and the figurative. We use metaphor to test and expand the boundaries of the material world. Metaphor, too, is a material in its effects. It infects our behavior and rewrites our existing reality. Queer lyricism can serve as a social intervention that calls upon a process of relating, a blurring of subject positions, and even a feeling of lostness. Its energies are primed to expose identity as a socially constituted practice. One of the tasks compatible with a queer lyric poetic seems to be the imagining of forms of sociality that are not humanist, that trouble identitarian discourse, and instead recognize an embodiment, a shared condition of all life forms, the grounding for our politics. Human understandings of embodiment are, of course, limited. For example, I cannot know how a whale processes the world around it, although I can speculate about some of its faculties and behaviors based on a handful of facts. I read that the whale perceives the ocean as black rather than blue and has broadside eyes that may allow it to look at two prospects from different angles at the same time. The implications are significant since perspective affects how an individual filters sensory data, creates memories, and makes meaning about the world around it. As a poet, I can hypothesize about its phenomenology and imagine the different forms its attentiveness might take. Through informed imaginative projection, I can try to represent the quality of light the creatures around it reflect, or its physiological reaction to the sight of a predator, yet the phenomenology of the animal will always remain opaque for me. Ultimately, there can never be complete transparency between two consciousnesses, animal or otherwise. The introduction of doubt, however, is useful in that it sets into relief the negative space around the whale. It teaches me about restraint and alterity and the ethical and temporal import of the imagination. Empirically, we understand animals provisionally in a series of moments, not necessarily in a continuous present. Sometimes, though, we each experience flashes of insight, moments of mutual understanding, and through the accumulation of these instances, we form connections, queer intimacies. Lyric poetry facilitates these connections by shuttling between subjectivities different from our own, enhancing personal and social experience, accenting the borders of our epistemologies, and calling upon the imagination to expose the actual conditions in life that stultify and impoverish us. The imaginative projection that undergirds lyric poetry enables us to inhabit bodies other than our own, to transverse the identities that we cling to or reject in life. The poetic imagination, a source of resilience and immanence, is a particularly useful queer resource. Given its plasticity and non-totalitizing character, it is poised to give us back novel possibilities for being. I am interested in a lyric poetry that is metaphor enlarging, that enhances and deepens the mysteries of life, that sensitizes us to sensation itself. Language does not provide transparency. It can ever only approximate meaning, just as our lexicon for relating to difference is lacking. For example, I am forced to choose between words like train or domesticate to discuss how I relate to my cat and to conceptualize how we have come to inhabit the same space, to live together. The better word, the one that suggests transformation, mansuetude, is a linguistic artifact without the cultural currency that it once had. Often today's animal representations, whether in biology, prose, or poetry, set into relief the borders of our own understanding and the insufficiencies of language to approach those we deem other. We can approach animal thought, though, through a queer form of feeling, which I imagine to be based upon a kind of surrender of habitual modes of perception and cognition, and an openness to the intervention of the imagination. The queer lyric solicits from reader and writer a different form of sensibility that does not circumscribe or limit sense in its corporeal and psychic valences, but rather makes feeling, with all of its vagaries and contingencies, its weird and nonlinear time patterns and transformative capacities, a site of activity that disturbs sense so as to return it back to a common vocabulary. Queer lyricism may test received meanings by freeing the senses of their traditionally formalizing roles and opening us up to the consciousness-heightening experience of feeling oneself feel, and in turn, feeling the self's own otherness. With its effectively rooted forms of sense-making, queerness seems closely related to touch. The touch that I invoke is erotic and charged with the capacity to disrupt the coherent subjects and to undermine the senses that we refer to as common. In the lyric, there is an immediate subjective repositioning. As readers, we participate in meaning-making, we inhabit the position of the speaker, and by extrapolation, we deconstruct and rewrite ourselves. Potentially, lyric poetry invites us to feel oneself as an organism, to feel the tensile and tenuous thread between a common sense and a brand of sense that does not submit to rational or deterministic discourse. In many ways, vertiginous and visceral, it dramatizes the incoherence of preconceived, psychic, rational, and corporeal definitions of sense. And in dislodging sense, a queer lyric may unhinge established meanings. To inhabit a state in which there is the play of contradictory meanings is to be receptive to the paradoxes and volatility immanent within feeling itself. How else to describe our feelings to our animal companions, those with whom we work, live, and play? How to explain the repulsion and splendor of the sublime animal, like the deep-sea creature blinking its soul through walls of darkness? Or the fear and attraction of that dense thicket where the animals go when a storm or death approaches? It is a queer kind of love.
Welcome, Joe. I'm excited to learn about transhumanist stuff. So
What I was interested in is the way that technology is changing and affecting the way that sexual identity and relations with the non-human actually progresses. And so that's why I use the term sort of transhumanism opposed to sort of post-humanism to sort of create that distinction. I would like to start with a quote from David Campbell, who's a professor of cultural and political geography at Durham University. He writes, "Whether we're talking of the body or of the state, or particular bodies and states, the identity of each is performatively constituted. Moreover, the constitution of identity is achieved through the inscription of boundaries that serve to demarcate an inside from an outside, a self from the other, a domestic from a foreign. In the specific case of the body, Judith Butler has argued that its boundary is tenuously maintained by the transformation of elements that were originally part of an identity into defiling otherness. To be sure, many insist on understanding the body, sex, and gender as naturalized and unproblematic. But for their claim to be persuasive, we would have to overlook the multifaceted normalizing codes and disciplining that seeks to establish and police understandings of what constitutes the normal, the accepted, and the desirable. Such codes affect an admission of their constructed nature and the contingent and the problematic nature of the identity and the body. Thus, in order to approach the question of technology from the starting point of whether or not it's natural, one would have to constitute a normal state of nature that extends and defiles all those who don't fit the prescribed norm. In the case of sexuality, those individuals who don't fit within the heteronormative gaze are demonized as other and often criminalized as a result, excluding not only same-sex partners, but also anyone who desires to have sex with a machine or an animal. In the case of science and technology, those individuals who don't have access to new developments remain constructed as either too primitive to survive or so helpless that they are in need of desperate assistance. In short, the power of the metaphor of development is that it gives the impression that the projects being carried out under that ideology are natural and inevitable. At length, the more we situate our understandings of technology from the perspective of whether or not it's natural, the more we take our agency away from future developments that are perceived of as inevitable. Even the perspective that views technology as unnatural still views the defensive nature within static terms, subscribing to similar normalizing tendencies that demonize difference. The fact that normal is traditionally defined in statistical terms, so that way of normal ranges of intelligence, heart rates, and sexualities, is often forgotten when people strive to observe the normalcy of nature. Ironically, it is very rare to find anyone who is perfectly normal because there are countless abnormalities that must be factored into anyone's individual identity. Further, what is normal is not always natural, and what is natural is not always normal. In all cases, just because something is part of the state of nature says nothing on if it's desirable. In regards to homosexuality, Michael Warner, professor of English at Rutgers University, writes, "The lesson should be one of skepticism towards all norms and tastes of the majority. So it is ironic when we are told that our aspiration should be to see ourselves as normal. But this is defined to a false alternative. People who are defined by a variant set of norms commit a kind of social suicide when they begin to measure the worth of their relations and their way of life based upon a yardstick of normalcy." In regards to technology, when authors like Andy Clark claim that we should embrace coming science as a natural consequence of human evolution, it leaves out our agency to interact with forthcoming developments beyond an already defined set of norms. Striving to advance scientific mergers with biology from this perspective ignores how, this is quoting Haraway, a cyborg body was not born in a garden or seeks a unitary identity because it generates antagonistic dualisms without end or until the world ends. In short, a cyborg is not normal because it has always strove to break down what we understand as normal, as natural in the first place. Even if working with tools beyond our biological bodies is a natural state of affairs, it has been understood as an attempt to overcome the limits society faces by building upon current knowledge in contradictory ways. Ultimately, it is the construction of technology as beyond the scope of nature and the unnatural that holds the most potential for liberation. Once that perspective is realized, what future science means for us will always be up for contestation. From here, we can move past the exclusionary logic behind binary configurations such as technology and biology, truth and fiction, and natural and aberrant altogether. Whether nature is used to justify the continuation of technology or the reason to call for its abandonment, the end result is the same. In the first instance, development is poised as a structure of natural evolution that all humans should follow on their path towards affluence and civilization. Put simply, this belief depicts human evolution as a linear process where we naturally move from hunters and gatherers to industrialized citizens to computer-savvy intellectuals to a new wave of post-humans and so on. Imposing such a lens ignores the human cultures that choose not to develop in a first-world manner, which prioritizes technology above all else. It also ignores the fact that despite evolution being natural, there is nothing to say that a single-celled organism should eventually evolve into a chimpanzee and then into a human in order to consider it successful. If it wasn't for all the diversity of evolutionary choices made by all the creatures, we would not live in a world as rich in diversity as we do today, despite the rampant extinction underway. Majori Spiegel, founder of the Institute of Development of Earth Awareness, points out how it was common only a quarter century ago for charts to depict the evolution of primates from distinct ancestors up through various hominids to a black person and finally through to a fully upright Aryan male. However, Darwin himself believed that evolutionary history is no basis for deciding who is better than whom. Evolution occurs as the result of genetic mutations, and there is no moral basis for declaring that the mutated form is better than the unmutated ancestral form. The more we learn about the Earth's environment, its ecosystems, and the creatures who live there, the more we see the absurdity in the concept of ranking species against one another. All life on Earth is inextricably bound together in a web of mutual interdependence. History bears witness to how the perceived naturalness of evolution has been used to breed out undesirable or so-called unnatural through eugenics programs, not so dissimilar to what we saw in World War II. Indigenous North Americans were exterminated, and Africans were enslaved due to their very savageness that supposedly needed to be tamed via the technologies of civilization. This is precisely why early colonists like Sir Francis Bacon conceptualized science as an entity that would bind nature and reduce her to a slave that could perform useful services for Europeans. Western science became the benchmark by which productions of non-Western civilization were measured. Perceived primitivism was justified in civilizing efforts of the white man's burden. In the second instance, where disbelievers shun technology because it offends their very foundation in nature, the disciplinary outcome of establishing normalcy remains similar. By working to protect nature, Luddites presume a static identity for the natural world to inhabit that is once again essentialized to the whole of humanity. Countless populations have been enslaved or slaughtered because their ancestors somehow got it wrong and developed in different directions, whether it's believing in polytheism or Gaia herself, for instance. In this way, third world countries became subject to increasingly sophisticated methods of control, where anthropocentric doctrines of secular salvation, the ideologies of progress, normalcy, and hypermasculinity, and theories of cumulative growth of science and technology gave legitimacy to ancient forces and creeds of violence. Even when this development is portrayed as something other than technology, such as religion or cultural traditions, the belief that future scientific breakthroughs must be discarded upholds a state of development that remains constructed as normal. Whether this nature is technology or something else altogether is irrelevant. What matters is that in all cases, the foregrounding of any singular notion of development as natural works to demonize aberrations from the norm as something that needs to be changed. As Haraway explains, consciousness of exclusion through name is acute. Identities seem contradictory, partial, and static, since how we understand our identity in relation to others is often divided by the divides over difference and what we perceive of as unnatural. Once identity is recognized for its contradictory and partial nature, whether or not any development is natural, the concept reveals its own irrelevance because what is considered normal is always up for reconfiguration. Returning to the construction of the natural sexuality for a moment to serve as a continuing parallel, those people beyond the heteronormative gaze are often defended or demonized based upon how the nature of their desires are constructed. However, to argue that any sexuality is either natural or aberrant escapes the complexity of the situation because it takes nature as data. To put it simply, sex changes. As it does, the need for sexual autonomy changes. Civilization doesn't just repress our original sexuality, it makes new kinds of sexuality. Sexual autonomy has grown by making room for new freedoms, new experiences, new pleasures, new identities, and new bodies. Even if many of us turn out to live in the old ones without complaining. Variation in this way is a precondition of autonomy, as much as it is also the outcome of autonomy. Pleasures once imaginable only with disgust, if at all, became the material out of which individuals and groups elaborate themselves. Conditions that prevent variation or prevent knowledge of such possibilities from circulating undermine sexual autonomy. The parallel of technology should be explicit when one thinks of a recent series of U.S. proposed laws that aim at prohibiting cybersex in the Philippines, providing penalties for its violation. Just imagine what these laws would do when cybersex leaves the virtual world as robots become integrated into human sexual relations, as predicted to happen in the next 5 years. Certainly, the possibility of sex with robots could prove a mixed bag for instance, robot sex can provide an outlet for criminal sexual urges as well as mistreatment of robots. When it comes to the sex and love with robots, the ethical issues and how to treat them are something we'll have to consider very seriously. Despite these fears, however, the possibility of robotics and cyber sex to provide new autonomy to sexual identity cannot be overlooked, and it can be equally transformative. Already, to automorph our sexuality, we're using biotechnology and plastic surgery, chemical messengers to manipulate our sexual characteristics and hormonal makeup, and psychological enhancements to help us develop new identity profiles. The possibility is that we might have as many genders as colors in the rainbow, or as many types of genitalia as patterns of flowers. To decry or defend these possibilities based upon the degree of which they're natural eliminates the diversity that inheres in the process of technological development and biological evolution. Another example beyond sexuality is the perceived naturalness of human domination over animals and nature itself. Conceiving of nature as static necessarily confines its potential in order to take control of it. Just as some moralists work to uphold the sanctity of normal heterosexual relations, primitivists decry the advancements of ongoing technology in order to protect the pristine beauty of the wilderness. In either case, both attempt to gain knowledge of the other by defining themselves based upon the naturalness they seek to uphold. In the case of the primitivists, nature is protected under human stewardship, whereas in the case of the moralists, distortions of nature are deemed as threatening to the civilized self. Oftentimes, in both situations, we find various identities locked behind the bars of social construction and caged doors. Upholding a universal understanding of nature ignores how the wildness of technology and the untouched forest are always mutable and subject to change. We associate wildness and freedom with chaos, whereas someone who is literally broken is civilized and thus a positive figure. That which is under our control, even if it must be killed, is positive, while that which retains autonomy is threatening and negative. This is precisely why our companion animals often have to be broken in by the state and federal laws before becoming domesticated enough to be sold as pets, even as some desire to live with the supposedly authentic animal. Yet, animals, identities, and species are all built upon self-referential definitions that are different from varying vantage points. Indeed, there is no authentic animal to ever be had, since it's always already changing in relationship to others. This is why as monkeys become telekinetic and bobcats are bred with house cats, it will be impossible to determine why precisely these new beings are unnatural, just as new kinds of sexuality have as much validity as ancient ones. In short, the point is that we must be open to new configurations, even when they are neither natural nor a total aberration from the norm. Defending either the development or prohibition of technology on natural grounds has tangible consequences outside of assuming a static nature to reality. It also creates the conditions in which advocates claim the right to protect that so-called natural reality at any cost. Thus, we have nations willing to defend the right to possess nuclear technology even in the face of war and atomic extinction, while religions have continuously participated in ongoing inquisitions to reform or exterminate those people who don't believe in the truth of their God. The problem here is that if we all share certain material conditions, there is a natural limit to the way we must construct our worlds. Political events, however, are never just material. Unlike earthquakes, political events never just happen. Events and concepts depend on each other. Together, they are deeds, and through our deeds, we make the world we know. Hence, even when transhumanist advocates claim that we've overcome the limits of biology, such beliefs continue to inscribe a social reality that constructs our world so as to defend the confines of what's considered normal. Creating difference in this way to define aberrations from normalcy therefore acts in a regressive manner so as to create delineations and prevent fluidity. For instance, either an amoeba and a human have the same organization, in which case evolutionary lineages disappear because all living systems have the same organization, or else an amoeba and a human have different organizations, in which case organization must not have been conserved and evolutionary change is effaced. Once it's readily accepted that not all living things are the same, and that evolution, which has brought so-called higher forms of intelligence, was natural occurrence, those creatures that haven't evolved are discriminated against as being inferior. This is why some people could walk on grass without a second thought, and others could dress themselves in the skins of other animals with only a moment of hesitation, if any. Yet, if we embrace the difference between living things as a fluid exchange of identity and interpretation, rather than some transcendental nature, we can see how biological systems and technology are unlike earthquakes, and never simply happen without our discursive constructions that define their existence. The use of tools as an adaptation of biological evolution is but one example where the complex web of environmental conditions and social ingenuity combine to reshape the simple dichotomy between the two. Where we hallucinate a central self, wherein our special individual essence resides, we find only a grab bag of tools and an ongoing narrative, a story we, as the assemblage of tools, spin in order to make sense of our actions and projects. There is no self, if by self we mean something central or cognitive essence that makes who I am and what I am. In its place, there is just an ongoing drive to tell a story, to paint a picture in which the I am the central player. Similarly, certain coalitions of biological and non-biological problem-solving elements, grab bags and mind tools, prove more stable and enduring than others. Likewise, while the routine use of tools is well known in great apes and chimpanzees, some people insist that the step between these crude tools and those made by early humans require a giant cognitive leap. However, the primitive use of tools led certain species of monkeys to craft spears to kill bush babies for meat, which has important implications for how we think about the evolution of tool use in our own species. By developing more advanced tools, these monkeys have changed their limits of their nature, exploiting niches by using innovation and creativity to get around competition. However, at the same time, it was nature's competition that drove the creation of technology in the first place. In the end, the two concepts escape a simple binary relationship since they remain codependent insofar as nature shapes the face of tool making as much as tool use changes the face of nature. No doubt, the tools we incorporate to use alongside our minds are neither foreign to nor fully apart from the natural world because there was never static nature as such before creatures branched out beyond their biological bodies to begin with. Ultimately, since all creatures are mediated by a combination of their genes and environment, no creature has ever been fully constrained to their body alone, thereby rendering static concepts of nature inadequate to understand our relationship with the world. The continual outgrowth of systems of communication goes a long way in demonstrating how the fluids of nature and non-biological prop are already mingling and have been at least since the dawn of spoken human language. The ability to interact with one another through verbal and written means of communication has allowed human intelligence to evolve beyond the individual alone as the self acquires ever more information from the feedback of others. At the same time, the language systems that have proven most successful in communicating complex ideas to fit the surrounding environment are those forms of dialogue that live on. As a result, communication takes on a life of its own, co-inhabiting the biological bodies of those who utilize it to alter their knowledge in order to better survive by communicating with others themselves. Catherine Haley explains, language is not merely like a virus, it is a virus, replicating through the host to become visible as a green fish in the flesh and crab parasites tearing at the base of the spine and the brain. Here, within the represented world of the text, techniques of inscription merge with incorporated practices in a cyborg configuration of explosive potential. The double edge of this potential can always turn against their master and become infectious in turn. Making the word flesh is both how the virus infects and how the vaccine disinfects. In either case, the flesh will not continue unchanged. No doubt, the physical imagination of what our bodies are capable of is based upon the configurations we think and communicate with each other. In this way, the life of communication is not independent from the biological beings who are an outgrowth of the very languages that shape their understanding of the body. Like dichotomies inherent in questions of naturalness, we find the distinction between where the line of communication ends and the species that speaks and begins is equally illusionary. No doubt, neither would be in existence without relationship with the other that is always already subject to change. It is precisely this fluidity of possible reconfigurations that ungrounds static defenses of nature and biological borders. Just as much as language evolves out of the creatures it emerges from, so too does the understanding of nature and the surrounding ecology emerge from the stories we tell about them. Our stories therefore not only create, but are created by the reality of biological circumstances we confront. Because our stories inform the possibilities of our imagination, our interpretation of how we approach nature and technology is necessarily fluid and defines limiting definitions. Feminist vegetarian theorist Carol Adams explains, "We are the species who tell stories. Through narratives, we confer meaning upon our lives. Our history are structured as stories that postulate beginnings, crises, and resolutions. Dramas and fictions animate our imagination with stories that obviously have a beginning and an end. Narrative, by definition, moves forward towards resolution. Though these narratives are presently constructed as approaching a natural conclusion to their tales, once we understand these stories as mediated events, opposed to concrete realities, this need no longer be the case. No doubt because communication is always at stake in our use of it, the very lives of our stories inhabit and are contingent upon the forms of language we choose to pursue. Whether we use oral poetry, cave paintings, electronic recordings, or instant messaging will affect the methodology behind which our stories will emerge. How we choose to relate to normative defenses of nature in the name of or against technology must be second-guessed because these stories will never come to a complete close. In fact, the fact that an unmanned seaplane developed by the University of Michigan also became the world's most unusual dolphin toy shows the humor behind believing in any one interpretation. Where humans saw an advanced robotic machine, the dolphin saw nothing but nature and another flying creature to play with. While the author of the article believed that the dolphins were the ones who were fooled, it is worth wondering if it wasn't the researchers who thought that they could create something entirely new were the ones who were really fooled. The point here is that the seaplane's essence remains up for interpretation since it's neither purely natural nor entirely machine because it carries a life of its own based upon the surrounding environment from the laboratory table to the depth of the ocean. Thank you.
Okay, we have lots of time for questions and answers. I'm gonna let language viralize me, reconfigure me as a cyborg while we get Jess back on for Q&A. If anyone has any questions, raise your hand up or grab the mic.
Hello? Okay. So my question is for the first speaker. Can she hear me? Do we know?
I'll get her on. I'm gonna have to type,
Okay.
the question out, so be very kind and keep it brief, if you can. Well, let's see. She can't hear you. I've got to type.
Oh, boy. So tell me when you're ready.
Oh, let's see. If you can ask now, I'll type it, and we'll see if she gets her video back working.
Okay. So, puppy. I'm interested in her use of Kristeva's theory of the abject. My understanding is that Kristeva argues that the abject is a product of breaking away from the mother and establishing independent identity. I wondered if she agreed with this, and if this is the case, is it actually possible to avoid production of the abject? Is the abject a necessary part of the human condition of independent subjecthood?
Oh, I'm so sorry, but my spelling is getting really bad. Okay. Well, so hopefully, okay, she's getting back on. Do we ever get this to work yet today?
I haven't been to room.
Skype Q&A. Maybe while she's trying to, oh wait, here she is.
Was the sound on the computer turned back up?
Thank you.
I just got the image for that I wanted to send you. Sorry, just let me read the question. Is it possible to avoid production of the abject? I don't think so. I've thought a lot about this because I wonder how to change, in terms of, say, animal liberation, how to change away from how we see animals, and obviously always trying to think of how to make, talk to people about going vegan and to find the ways to bring out that objection. And I think it's to the core of our beings in this capitalist society, and that hopefully with kind of these ideas of critical animal studies, we can start to undo the objections that we get kind of sold to us from childhood. But I don't think in this society it's possible to be brought up without objection, unless you were maybe brought up in an amazing animal sanctuary with queer people. But at this point in our society, I don't think it is. But I do remain hopeful that one day we can have a revolution and find ways to produce ourselves without objections. Shall I keep talking? This is quite strange that I can't see or hear any of you. Did you see the image that I sent you? Okay. Okay, what were the other questions? Is it a necessary part of the human condition of independent subjecthood? Okay, great. Yeah, so that's the image from the Animal Liberation Victoria action that I was talking about, and we're all, yeah, as you can see, holding a dead animal. We stood there for about 45 minutes. Yeah, it was a really, really intense, sad action to be a part of. Gee, these are big questions for so early in the morning with my, I guess you've all been thinking for days and I'm just sitting in my computer chair. So is it necessary part of the human condition of independent subjecthood? I don't know if we can be boundaryless, but I don't think necessarily boundaries have to be a bad thing. They can be a positive thing. We can draw boundaries of ourselves and can have different ways that we identify and who we see ourselves as. But it's when those boundaries become the abject, when we see something different as outside of ourselves and as negative and bad, whereas without seeing the positives of the self, without seeing that, oh yes, where the difference, which is important, but that difference then in our society becomes the object, which is then used to create the self, as we talked about, and then, you know, by extension in capitalist society, making us being able to hate something and then therefore consume what is ourself and consume what makes our identity, rather than being, and then capitalism and neoliberalism takes this up and makes money off this consumption. That.
Okay, that was a fun experiment. They worked out okay, right? Next question. This is why everyone should sit closer, so I don't have to run around so much.
Okay, yeah, so this is actually a question intended for, or it came as a response to Jess's talk, so maybe I'll try and be brief and type it in, but I'd like to hear anyone in the room's response. It's just sort of complicating the idea of queerness and thinking about, at times, its complicities with anthropocentrism in a way that doesn't just dismiss that as, well, not queer enough or not the right kind of queer. So I think a lot about a friend of mine who does work on like hyper-masculine bear communities and leather communities that very much sort of enact their imagination of queer liberation through what I see as an objectification of animals, and I don't want to dismiss either. So I'm just trying to think of trying to complicate that a bit. So yeah, maybe that's a lot to take, but if anyone has responses.
I'll try to type that into it. Sure. Go ahead, Neil.
I'm reminded of a book, Queering the Non/Human, that, you know, talks about the ways in which that when we approach human identity or human sexual identity, that we view it as distinct, as like a human exceptionalism, where we think that human sexuality is distinct from other sexuality. So I think that when we're talking about like bear communities and stuff like that, is that while there is a objectification of the animal that could take place, there's also a way to sort of read it as us, or as bears being also animals in the way that relationship takes place. So the enactment of their queer identity is simultaneously an enactment that works against mainstream normative ideas of the way that identities and sexualities are supposed to shape itself. And so while there is some elements that may be exploitative of other creatures out there, that by pointing the emphasis on criticizing where communities fall short, it ignores the ways that it can also be sort of transformative. So I think that depending on whether you're an insider or an outsider, the way that I would address the question would be changed. Since I'm not part of the bear community, I would say that the onus is sort of looking at the ways that it's being utilized in liberatory struggles to sort of fight back against the way that heteronormativity has been constructed, but then in terms of being within that community, there's sort of a different relationship where we could be asked about how is it that our liberation is also simultaneously exploitative to others?
Yeah, that's the book that came to mind too when you asked that question. Heard, the editor, also makes the argument that posthumanism itself has a queering incipience, that we can use posthumanism and evolutionary studies as a lens for addressing queer, human and non-human identities. And Cohen makes the same argument in Medieval Identity Machines, that queer theory often does have this humanist bias, which limits its scope. Why confine ourselves to the realm of the human when we're thinking through issues of identity and sociality, when we can look to the rich dynamic interface among all creatures as a form of social being.
I have a lot to say on this topic. But what first comes to mind is at the university I go to during the Queer Week, I came down to kind of have a look around at what was happening, and there was they were having a barbecue that was full of dead animals, and then they also had the police marching band performing, and I couldn't help but see the irony here of the police and eating dead animals by these queer people, and the way in which I've been to so many different queer events where animals are being consumed, and that it's almost this kind of cool hipster thing with post-veganism that's happening a lot in queer communities in Australia, where animals are just seen now as only important when they're meat, and there's almost this wanting to always eat animals in these really kind of cool ways, and by using that to show kind of a class, I guess, as well comes into this by showing that you have all this money to consume these like cool hipster meats, which I see a lot in the queer community, and then also the barbecues. This way in which the queer community has totally disregarded animal liberation as well, I think, in a lot of ways, by being really into leather, into different kinds of fashion like fur, which is also I see in queer communities as well, this use of fur in fashion, and often even though it's like, oh, it's second-hand fur, and there's an understanding of that, there's also this kind of irony that has played out in kind of hipster queer culture around knowing that something's not okay, knowing that it's not that great to buy Nikes, but wanting to do it anyway because it's seen as being a way of showing your status in this capitalist society. Yeah, I could rant about this for a really long time.
That's how it works. What? Okay. Just making sure it's not Mullen.
I have a question, Sarah. In so much that I've read and heard, language has been used to distinguish humans from other kinds of animals, and I thought it was really interesting thinking about poetry and body language as a way of recognising continuity between humans and other species. In terms of your own creative practice, would you characterise that more as a kind of realisation of what you were doing already, or has that developed as part of the project?
It's a good question. I would say that, in working through my project and thinking about the politics of representation around animality, I've become more aware of kind of my own responsibility as writer and kind of creator of these creatures, and And, so what I've been thinking through and interested in my studies is other forms of communication between humans and animals, based in biosemiotics, for example, communication signals among humans and animals and among various species. And that's something I wanted to work into my poetics. I think I wanted to find, I think I wanted to realize that kind of theme in my own poetry through like a different kind of biological vantage, but it's also, I think, something I've worked through, or wanted to work through analogically through a metaphor that is, through the use of metaphor that can be both highly constructed, so the use of metaphor that might index its own constructed character, so that the dream of the poem or that kind of imaginary world still has a kind of skeptical potential as well, self-inquisitive potential as well. I don't know if that really answers it.
I'm just going to ask Joe a question. I was piqued during your talk about, particularly about the kind of the sex or ethical issues with robots that you brought up. And I was just first a clarifying question on what you mean by robot. If you mean like android or kind of a non-human shaped robot could also count, or does it matter if they have sentience or not?
Well, all of that, essentially. And yes, it does matter if they have sentience. I think that it's important to start thinking through these questions prior to technology and artificial intelligence becoming fully conscious, because when it hits that point, if we haven't started to theorize the relationship between us and, these now non-biological creatures that are coming into existence, they'll sort of already be too late. So I think that utilizing speciesism as a lens to understand our relationship to technology is a way that we can start thinking about it prior to the point of artificial intelligence becoming conscious. But certainly whether it be like Sony's VO or like, a humanoid would, complicate the issue as well.
Okay, but it would it include something like robotics that are used in their production facilities, like General Motors factories?
Yeah, I mean, like, people use robotics in all sorts of ways to gratify sexual pleasures currently, and like a lot of it is not necessarily autonomous, but it's certainly things that are being deployed. So like in terms of assembly lines and all sorts of different things, there are a lot of a lot of things out there about people who are on these assembly lines who are also sort of utilizing the machines in ways that they were not necessarily fully intended to be.
Are you doing a psychoanalytic reading of the microphone and molding them?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Questions?
My question is related to that, but at the very beginning of your talk, you threw together in a list, queer identities as they're understood now, sex with robots, and sex with animals. And I guess my question is two-parted. My question is why are you throwing all these things together? And for people who would ask, is that appropriate? Or for people who be offended by any of that, by the tying of queerness to, say, sex with robots, what would your response be?
Well, I think my response would be sort of similar when heterosexual populations got offended by sex with same-sex couples, or when gay communities got upset about transgenders and transsexuals like MTAPs and FMs having these forms of sexuality, being like, no, we're just trying to allow for gay marriage and not for these other forms of configurations that continue to exist. And so part of the reason why I put it together is to sort of show how, when I read things like trans politics and transsexuality and queerness as being something that is never sort of set static in stone, but something that's constantly moving beyond what's considered normal. So as like same-sex marriages becomes more normalized within American society, there are all sorts of other sexualities that continue to be even further demonized that are then forgotten about. And so like when the gay marriage debate hit the news, one of the big parallels that conservatives were like, well, once you allow for same-sex marriage, you're going to allow for marriage with dogs. And the response by the gay community was like, no, we draw the line here, they're not human. And to me, my response was be like, well, what's wrong with that species connection? Obviously, I have a lot of reasons for why that could be wrong, because there's ethical relations for how that could be established. But the fact that this is a sexuality that is just so unnatural that we can't think about it, even though the gay population was moving forward for something that was conceived as unnatural for the heterosexual population. So I think that there is a gut reaction to be like, this is offensive, how can you connect these things? But I think that that gut reaction is a similar gut reaction to what happens when the heterosexual community says that this is unnatural form of sexuality. So that's sort of why I connect to a conversation of whether or not we should use nature at all as something to be defended or a basis for how we conceive of identity.
Thank you.
Any more questions for Jess? Or can I let her off the hook because she's got to be bored? Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, I guess I also had a question for Joe, and just thinking about these different sort of pushing the boundary of what we think of as queerness, and thinking about the sort of messy cyborgness of humans and machines and non-human animals and all that. I guess if you could just say a bit more about how you sort of, I got a sense from your talk that sort of like there should be allowance for difference and proliferation and multiplicities, and I'm also just thinking about then how, again, thinking about complicities without drawing like necessary boundaries or stark boundaries, but thinking about the kinds of queernesses that are produced through the manipulations of animals and what I think we might call sort of exploitation. I mean the sort of queernesses that are produced in genetic manipulation, or the kinds of queernesses that are like really, I mean, like the sort of constant impregnation of cows for dairy farming is like pretty queer, really, in some ways. So just thinking about, I don't know, I'm always trying to think of like queer as not just liberatory, not just positive, but I wonder if I could just hear you speak a little bit about that and how to think through different queernesses or queernesses that are complicit in different things versus sort of resistant or.
Yeah, I mean, certainly some forms of queer performativity could be very negative and oppressive in populations, I guess you're pointing out, because that is not a quote-unquote natural way that for cows to have sex in the form of insemination. And I think that it's important that when approaching these questions that we don't just sort of be like, well, this is not normal, therefore it's bad, but we ask the relationship that came to bring it about. So when I think about questions of like bestiality, right, like I always find myself defending bestiality. It's not like I want to defend bestiality, but I find myself that as soon as people are like, well, you can't have sex with animals, that's always oppressive, it's like, well, why is it always oppressive? And it's not that it's innately oppressive, but it's that the social constructs that surround it mean that there yet to be a dialogue for you to figure out, whether or not, the cat that you live with is actually consenting. Or so in the instance of the cow, there's a clear instance of where there is not consent to what's happening to that being. And so I think that's important that as we approach, or expand what queer sexuality is, that it's not just perceived as it's good because it's queer, but what is that relationship that queerness actually is emerged within, right? So that's when I get to talking about how we have to pay attention to the social environments and the constructions that emerge within each relationship that we find, opposed to trying to come up with absolute ways of saying this is good or this is bad. So I think with your bear question, this is why I address it sort of an insider-outsider, is that the way that question gets answered depends on the place and social location that you come from. And so like when I look at the dairy industry, that place and social location that dairy farmers come from is a very negative form of queer sexuality, if you would label it that. But in a different relationship with farmers that, may have, some sort of more egalitarian relationship with their cows, it may not necessarily have that same sort of connotation. I've yet to see that be the case, but I would not want to say that it's, always problematic at the same time. But I think that that's, one of the things that, like, when Foucault talks about biopower, it's both productive and destructive simultaneously. And I think that queerness and a lot of other sorts of resistance or liberatory politics operate in that same sort of way. Like when we say we must go vegan or veganism is good, right? There's also an oppressive dynamic to saying we must abstain from a certain action because not all people have the same sort of access.
I just want to add something on that over there. J. Jack Halberstam came here to Rice recently and gave a talk about kind of animals and anarchy. It was an interesting departure in Halberstam's work. And over the course of the conversation brought up how much flack is dished out because Halberstam makes kind of an argument that kind of your relationship with your pet is often very immoral, that it's a kind of a false and forced intimacy, potentially at least. And then so, Halberstam always gets lots of angry people, dog and cat lovers, right? And at one point, even argued kind of like, well, weirdly connected to what you're saying is kind of why do you think that your relationship with your dog or your cuddling is any better than bestiality? You know, you don't know what kinds of pressures the dog is under to conform into kind of something this habit of intimacy, which I think is like really off base and misguided, but I can see the logic there. Do you think it's kind of similar to what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I've read some articles about cats purring is not actually a sign of love or happiness, but it's actually them stressed. And when cats come to you and sit on your lap and purr, it's because they feel that there is a need to help comfort you, and not necessarily because they want to. And it's a way that they feel that they're giving themselves over to what they have to do in order to make, their companion human happy, so that way they get fed. So, and I'm not a scientist, so I don't know how these things, how they came up with that. But I think it's interesting because when you do live with a companion animal, they're forced to interact with you. And that forced interaction, while it may seem like, oh, they love me when I come home, they run up to me, right? In the same way that if you have a person in a cage and you're the only one who's giving interaction to that person, the person's going to be very happy to have that level of interaction. But I live with cats right now. My cats are alone, and I come back, and I don't know if that's is a purely ethical relationship. Even though they come from shelters, it doesn't necessarily mean that I should be living with cats.
So there's kind of a need to recognize individual and species difference that is kind of required to combat speciesism that way. Really, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just talking. Good question.
I have a question for Sarah. So you mentioned thinking about the idea of how poetry can act, and this is something that I think about a lot with respect to performance, and so I do a lot of music and using art or performance or poetry or whatever section that you, anyway, thinking about how it can be a site of resistance. And I mean, you speak more specifically to queer lyrical poetry. And you mentioned that it's chaos and troubling. And I was wondering if you could, which you already did a great job speaking to that, your personal interaction with what your creative process ends up being. But sorry, okay, this is kind of all over the place because I'm having a lot of thoughts. Are you familiar with Christian Bach, the poet?
Not well enough to speak.
Okay, well, he has this project right now that's, he has assigned parts of a poem to different bacteria, and as they mutate and grow, the poetry ends up changing by way of like transcriptase and all these kinds of, basically by the way that bacteria mutates. And I was wondering if you had given any thought to, like, a lot of things that have come up in this conference is the idea of, empowering animals or giving animals, or non-human animals, well, everybody. I mean, this is what it ends up being about empowerment.
however that may be. But yeah, using poetry or art in a way that can be an act. And like how, I don't know, have you done any work with animals? And I have no idea where I'm going. I'm so sorry, everyone. But these are the jumbles of my brain right now. And you can do what you want with them.
Okay, I like
You
it.
don't even have to comment. That's fine.
I know that work is.
It's sexy, but yeah, so I don't have a clear thought, but basically, whatever you make of that, I would appreciate it.
That's fine. Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely interested in experimental approaches to poetry, to performance poetry. I guess I see metaphor as having a subversive potential. In that, I think that metaphor can be, problematic in that it involves, kind of transfer from one thing to a figurative thing, right? And so there's a kind of slippage that happens. And so, I'm interested in some ways in kind of exposing that possible leap that happens in metaphor, in which there is a kind of categorical or identitarian principle at work within metaphor. But I'm also working within metaphor and trying to expose its limits as well. I don't know if that really answers your question, but I guess that's that's where I'm seeing a kind of experimentalism emerge in my own poetry.
Any last question? One last question. Okay, and before we thank our speakers, I have to make an announcement. I just want to remind everybody that breakfast tomorrow starts at 9:30, and at 10:30 we'll be having our first panels tomorrow. And if you're looking for dinner plans tonight, we've made an agreement with the Vegan Society for Peace, who host a potluck. And tonight, I've got the information for that. Yeah, from 6 to 9. It's at a local church, the CKDL Church, in the reception hall. The address is 2353 Rice Boulevard, and that's right at the corner of Greenbrier and Rice Boulevard. And if you're curious about getting there, let me know. It's a bunch of cool vegan people who have lots of food there. And did we get pizzas?
Yes.
Yeah, and
It's really easy
we,
to get there. You just go that way down University Ave until you hit Greenbrier, turn right, and then it's at the corner of Greenbrier and Rice.
we'll be outside to help you get over there. We've provided pizza on your behalf as your contribution to the potluck. So you can go and eat pizza or try the people's stuff. It'd be really fun.
They also have some speakers, like we'll have a vegan chef talking or some other things as well.
So, yeah. And I have a nice event going on tonight, so we thought we'd share that. Anyway, thanks everyone so much. Thanks so much. I might be going if my brain is making out later.
When I was doing this special,
One, there is robots, you know,
when I was editing the special building issue, someone sent in a paper on beast colonies, and like the two other editors were like, no, we won't touch bestiality. And I didn't think the paper was more than just such a, I was like,
I was typing this right now.
I was like, this is very simple, and I wonder if tomorrow, no, and other stuff.
That's why you sat here like so.
Yeah.
Sorry? Oh, yeah.